India in a Globalizing World by Dr. Subbarao, then Governor Reserve Bank of India. Then Energy and the Future of Peaceful Nuclear Technology by Dr. Anil Kakodkar. Then Reviving the Indian Economy, Problems and Prospects by Dr. Sanjay Baru. Then MNREGS, Employment Growth and Development in Rural India by Dr. Mihir Shah, Member Planning Commission. Another lecture by Dr. T. Ramaswamy, Secretary, Science and Technology, on Center-State Collaboration and Dissemination of Technology. And the latest, the last, which was about 5 days ago, how small and medium enterprises and startups can raise money from the market, by Mr. U.K. Sinha, Chairman, SEBI. It was significant in the fact that it showed marked improvement in Sino-Indian relations, the high point being the visit of the then Prime Minister Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Mr. Menon has also served as Ambassador to Israel and High Commissioner to Sri Lanka and Pakistan. He was appointed Foreign Secretary in 2006 and is currently the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister. A major milestone of his career was the Indo-US nuclear deal, for which he worked hard to convince nuclear supply group nations to get a clean waiver for nuclear supplies to India. So I think this is a very important event and a very important occasion for us here in Trivandrum. I know him and of course Mohini sitting in front of me quite well. Actually, I met him for the first time about 40 years ago when he came to Cochin. He did his district training in Ernakulam, and I was sub-collector at that point of time. But over the period 2005 or 6, I think, to 2011, we worked very closely together. He was then first the Foreign Secretary and then the National Security Advisor. And I know that he is a man of great maturity and of great humility. And whatever he has to say, he expresses cogently and he expresses in a forthright manner. I think he has distinguished himself for the last 4 years as the National Security Advisor, put the country on a different wavelength so far as our external relations are concerned. The National Security Advisor looks after both internal as well as external security, and he is also a prominent member of the Nuclear Command Authority. So very, very important, very, very confidential things are dealt with by him. I'm also happy that so many distinguished people have come to this meeting. I must welcome in particular Mr. V. Ramachandran, my senior colleague, the Chief Secretary, Mr. Bharat Bhushan, Mr. Balasubramaniam, Chief of Police, and Mr. Professor Rajshekharan Pillai, the chairman of the vice chairman, vice president, I suppose, of the Council for Science, Technology and Environment, and Jyoti Lal, who is the secretary. He calls himself Secretary Additional Charge because he is holding so many additional charges at any point of time. So it's nice to have all of you here. I welcome you to this meeting, and I'm sure that we're going to hear a very important lecture today from a very, very distinguished person. I welcome Mr. Shivshankar Menon once again.
I thought I would do very briefly is to scan our internal, our external security environment, and within which we try and enhance India's security, and then to try and describe briefly the challenges and the opportunities that we face, and then hopefully open it up to a discussion and to hear your views on how it is. As Chandrasekhar mentioned, speaking in Kerala, I don't have to say that it's virtually impossible to separate internal security from external security. Kerala has always been, I think, the part of India that is most connected to the rest of India and to the rest of the world. And through, well, intellectually, through trade, culturally, the diaspora, every which way. And I think the mosaic that we see here is proof of that. So when we look at our security environment today, internal, external, what really stands out? In virtually every respect, our security environment is undergoing a phase transformation. We seem to be at a hinge moment, and let me try and explain why I think so. Internally, if you look at India today, we're undergoing a period of unprecedented social and economic change, with urbanization, social mobility, leading to a whole new set of security challenges. As a state, we in India are learning or have learned how to deal with organized violence. If you look at the figures in terms of incidents, in terms of civilian casualties, in terms of security forces killed, as a result of violence in the Northeast, in J&K, due to terrorism or due to Naxalism, left-wing extremism, all these figures are steadily declining for the last decade or so. Every one of them. The only but, and this is a very big but, that's not true when you look at what we regard as social violence. In 2012, 2013, the figures for communal incidents, for deaths as a result of communal incidents, the number of communal incidents increased each year. When you look at gender crimes, you look at crimes against the person, all these are going up. So while India as a country is learning how to deal with organized violence, and I think we are getting more efficient at that, we still, as a society which is changing so fast, which is so rapidly evolving, the social equilibrium that we take for granted and that we've counted on to maintain peace within our society, that really is under severe stress. And the aspirations, the anonymity, and the rootlessness that comes with urbanization, with very rapid social change, and this is change at a pace which we have never known in our history before, I think that removes or at least weakens the traditional social restraint. So traditional policing, or at least the kind of policing that we have developed over time to deal with left-wing extremism, to deal with terrorism, to deal with separatism, therefore needs to evolve. It's no longer the first, the best, or the preferred answer to this kind of challenge. Now, given the fact that we are a unique society, I don't think you can look around the world and find another society that looks like ours. We need to find our own creative ways to deal with this. And it really needs serious attention across the board. This cannot be left just to police institutions or to a few think tanks or even just to government. It has to be something, it has to be social, it has to be done across the board, through academia, social scientists, concerned citizens. And that, I think, is something which is a huge new challenge. I think that is something which is very different from what we are used to dealing with before. We gave a job to the state learned how to deal with whether it was terrorism, left-wing extremism, separatism, and we managed. And to my mind, this is the greatest security challenge that we as India face today. And this is not a challenge that can be solved by some technical fix, by police modernization, or better weapons and pay, or by new technologies, by new techniques. I don't think so. This needs actually political, economic, administrative, and ultimately social solutions. I mean, we need to look at. I think Kerala actually is the one place which has made a good beginning. When you look at community policing in India, Kerala is the one who really took the first steps to do so. And if we can take that message to the rest of the country, I think we'd have done something very, very useful. Externally also, when I said that we seem to be undergoing a phase transformation in terms of internal security, externally also, when you look at the international system today, it's undergoing a major shift into, I suppose, what can only be called the post-economic crisis world after 2008. The US is circling the economic wagons and is trying to negotiate new free trade agreements, the TTP in Asia Pacific, TTIP across the Atlantic, which are plurilateral and which try and raise the standards to suit the West's comparative advantage. And the two post-Cold War decades of an open international trading system, of the free flow of international capital, of which the biggest beneficiaries were actually China and India, those 2 decades are over. And since with the 2008 crisis. So we are moving into a much harsher economic climate globally in which to try and transform India. Politically, each of the regions which affects our security directly are the ones that affect us most directly. Each of them is no longer tranquil. You look at uncertainty in the international system is much higher than it has been for a very long time. West Asia, you know, is in turmoil. East Asia is no longer harmonious. Jihadi terrorism is globalized. You look at it all the way across, from Libya through Syria, through Yemen, to wherever, all the way into Afghanistan, Pakistan. The Asia-Pacific region is witnessing what is probably history's greatest peacetime arms buildup, both in quantity and in quality, if you look at the entire Asia-Pacific region. And the sole superpower, wrongly in my view, is perceived as being somehow in retreat or disinterested. China is much more active and is much more engaged and is rapidly accumulating power. And the global commons, whether it's the high seas, whether it's outer space, whether it's cyberspace, is all much more contested now than it ever was before. So these naturally pose new kinds of risks and threats to us. And those threats are much more serious or complex before. Of course, there's no such thing as absolute security. And we also have the means today to try and mitigate these threats to an extent that would have been inconceivable even 1 generation ago. Now, not all these changes are necessarily negative from India's point of view. I think Kishore Mehbubani says that India is entering a geopolitical sweet spot, that actually this is a situation which works well for India. But whether that's right or not, I think we need to start doing some creative thinking and a creative debate on these issues, on how we need to adjust to these kinds of changes. The other big development, of course, is the rise of China and of several other powers in the Asia-Pacific. Bilaterally with China, we have shown that we can manage our differences while we develop relations in areas where our interests are congruent. We have brought the negotiations on the boundary between the special representatives to the second stage of the agreed 3-stage process. The first stage was to agree the principles and the guiding principles which would apply to a boundary settlement. That we did by 2005. We signed an agreement. The second stage, we are to agree on a framework for a boundary settlement, and that's the stage we are at now. And the third stage would be when we actually agree a fair, reasonable, and mutually acceptable settlement of the boundary. China is today our largest trading partner in goods and seeks to invest and to use her excess capacity for manufacturing in India and to invest in and build infrastructure in India. And she's also very keen to involve us in connectivity, whether through the Maritime Silk Route or through the BCIM corridor, Bangladesh, Myanmar corridor, or across undisputed portions of the border. And China is potentially an economic opportunity to us. Last year, I think 96 million Chinese traveled abroad as tourists, and they're looking at India as another. Our approach has been to engage with China, and we have a very robust dialogue structure with them, discussing everything from counterterrorism to Afghanistan and we work together where we can, whether it's WTO or whether it's climate change negotiations. We also have a common interest in preventing terrorism and extremism in the periphery, which is common to both of us. But the fact is that we also compete. We compete for markets, we rub up against each other in this periphery which we both share, and in the world. So we have a bivalent kind of relationship, and maybe the best example is maritime security, where we both want the main sea lanes from the Persian Gulf, which go through the Indian Ocean and further east, to stay open, because we depend on them for our trade, for our energy. And yet both of us are building up the capacities to see how we can do this on our own or with our friends. When you look at the subcontinent as well, with the exception of Pakistan, our neighborhood actually presents an improving picture where there's increasing hope and progress. Each of our close neighbors has gone through domestic transformations, fundamental domestic transformations in the last few years. And each of them have chosen to move away from extremism and to try and build democratic qualities. Whether you look at Nepal, whether you look at Bangladesh, you look at the Maldives, each of them has made the same positive choices from our point of view. And this has also been the decade when South Asia is more integrated economically than at any time since the subcontinent was partitioned. So, while these transitions are unfinished, at least they've improved our ability to work with our neighbors for our own security. Whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Nepal, in each case, the willingness and the ability to work together is much higher than it was before, to deal with terrorism, to deal with other threats too. But the challenge now is to step up our game. As long as South Asia was a sort of geopolitical backwater, nobody was interested. Today, all the great powers are interested in what happens in South Asia. It's one of the fastest growing regions in the world, if you look at it in the last decade. It grew faster than most other regions in the world. And now everybody's interested. So now it's much more competitive. It's a competitive environment in which you will see much more involvement by the great powers, by everybody else. And we can no longer take the Indian subcontinent, as it were, for granted. We need to go out there and do much more. If you look at our extended neighborhood, our Look East policy, which was started in 1992 by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, I think has been an unqualified success. More than half our trade now goes east. We do over $70 billion